I first want to say thank you to Sarah. I feel like that was like an incredibly insightful framing that is not generally at these sorts of events. So really thank you for that. My name is Sarah Friedman, and I'm with a project called the Better Data Center Project. We are a relatively new organization. We were founded a year ago, April. My colleague and I were each at the Department of Energy, where we were leading community benefit plans, which were essentially attached to our large infrastructure projects and loans and grants to ensure that host communities and local workers had some protections. So a little bit after the administration changed, I think we were each staying in, and we kind of started to see, I think, just a little sooner than some other sectors, how our federal resources internally were being diverted to data centers. Nuclear or workforce programming was likewise being redirected to training for nuclear, coal, and gas for data centers. And at the same time, we were really kind of seeing with the dismantling of the federal government, a lot of folks losing their jobs, and local communities who may have directly or indirectly relied on federal agencies in support for capacity going away. So we thought, let's see if we can kind of marry these two things and support local communities with this onslaught of data centers and energy projects by providing pro bono technical assistance. So we just kind of started doing that. We were in a dark place and we didn't really have anything else to do. So, and now today it has really, we had no idea the scale of what we would see. At that initial point, our really biggest concern was we were very active in industrial decarbonization projects, and we were like, oh, these data centers are moving forward and they're using this like really finite renewable energy and transmission capacity, and that's going to impact steel decarbonization. And now like that seems like the sweetest, like cutest of concerns to have. So yeah, we just aim to provide, kind of facts and support communities. It is extremely busy. We get 4 to 5 requests per week through kind of, I guess I would say, like repeat pro bono customers. People tell their friends. It is people are very scared at the moment, and they really don't know what's going on, and they are often reaching out just into the ether to see who they kind of come back with. I would say the interesting thing about this work is most of the people who reach out to us are like kind of just people. So they're not affiliated necessarily with a big group. They may be in a group of like 1 or 2 people, like communities for this, or they may be really just like first-time community residents who may have like never been involved in an environmental issue or really kind of civic engagement before. And we also get a lot of requests from local governments, which we also respond to as we consider everyone in the community. So I think, we all kind of know this stat, but as Sarah identified, like the speed and the scale of this new industry is unprecedented, at least in my lifetime. I think this second stat, which is by 2028, this could consume 12% of energy, was at the last December, and I think already that is extremely conservative. I will say, so most of our work is not in California at all. And I think one thing that's really important to get across is this is a fossil fuel boom. That is what it is. And so when people talk about concerns about data centers, for the most part, they're talking about, wow, this is a 9 gigawatt gas plant, which is going up. And over the year, the scale of which these tend to be gas and the scale of the gas plants are growing enormously. So as mentioned, so I live in California. I've done a lot of work in California over the last 20 years, but my data center work has ended up being more focused in the Deep South in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Texas, mostly because that's where these big gas build-outs are. But I'll just share there are some common trends. So the water use, there are big indirect from, again, associated fossil fuel and gas plant and direct water uses, I think as Sarah got to, because of the lack of transparency and reporting, people don't really have a great sense always of what's happening and how much water is being used and the impacts of different technologies. Caltech has been doing some leadership work in that. And then water quality. So essentially what this means is what happens to the cooling water. It could go into an aquifer. Is it being treated? Is it being regulated? Where is it going? That can have ecosystem and municipal water impacts. And then these are just like really big. So what was there before? Was it agricultural land and, did it have habitat value? Was it land that was going to be a park or was perhaps like going to be a school or could have been? And then, how does this affect other land uses? And then again, so just the energy, I kind of can't even express enough the scale of this energy build out. In PJM, which is the balancing authority kind of version of, I guess I would say, our independent system operator for 13 states, this is going to enter 7 times the energy use by 2040. And what that has meant on the ground is just coal and gas plants that are inefficient and polluting that were about to be retired or not. Department of Energy has done a ton of emergency orders to keep these going, and then just a massive gas renaissance. As mentioned, we work a lot in Pennsylvania, who is both, the second biggest data center build out, but also will provide all of the gas build out for the rest of PJM, and that's because it's of fracking. So the areas we're seeing these going, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Texas, there's a lot of fracked gas available. And then this is something that Better Data Center Project has really done a lot of work in, which is that these data centers have a lot of on-site diesel generation. So this is a national stat. I think we've seen just 224, this tripling. In Virginia, there are enough permitted diesel generators for data centers to serve 4 million homes. To serve 20 million homes, and in Virginia, there are just 4 million homes. So there are 5 times as much diesel as there are households. And sometimes a single site can have hundreds of generators. And this is an issue I think that's really important here in California because we do have, the Energy Commission has siting authority through the diesel generators. And even though we have a lot of, we don't have today these big coal and gas plants, we do have a lot of proliferation of diesel generation, and it's moving forward in places like Vernon, Alviso, environmental justice communities with existing air quality burdens. The noise is really strong and very impactful to other communities and land uses. And then there's just kind of like these bigger impacts. So the mining to create the materials, the e-waste, the decommissioning, what's gonna happen afterwards, what does afterwards look like? That causes a lot of concerns and questions. So I think Sarah really kind of hit on a lot of this, but one thing that I think is really important to understand is we basically have a really new, impactful, extractive industrial use moving forward at like the worst time ever. We have, federal deregulation, so a lot of the laws that we could have relied on around gas and diesel and water protection, we don't have right now. In varying degrees. We also don't have partner federal agencies to enforce or to support communities and local government. So what that means, and then I think we also have this other trend that is also horrific timing, which is sort of like our abundance, let's build things faster, streamlining, which is getting a lot of state legislation and regulators excited. So what that means in practice is local governments are kind of it in a lot of cases. And that puts enormous pressure, particularly given that federal government has probably already reduced either direct capacity through grants or providing TA for both the local government and the community-based organizations who are involved. And again, this is against a backdrop where there might not be a lot of other new revenue coming in your pipeline. You might not have a lot of alternative big economic development proposals other than data centers. So there's some things I think that Sarah touched on that make this also sort of just a weird situation. So who is the developer is often really hard to tell. This isn't unique to data centers. I think, Developers often use project companies. When they come forward, they don't necessarily want to say their full name, but there is that layer. There's often sort of one entity that might be doing the prospective permitting and land use approval. That might be like Blue Owl. Then we might also have Amazon who owns it, but maybe the end customer is Anthropic. And often none of those things are really clear to the community. We also have this really pervasive use of non-disclosure agreements that's covering really what I would say is very basic information, like how much water and energy it would use, that is in a normal development project really clear to the public, and they're able to make decisions based on it. And then also, the number one thing that's pushing these projects is how fast we can get them built. And as folks in this room know, when you move really fast and you don't have public meetings, community engagement, comments, opportunity to frame a process, like things do not go well. So yeah, I think what we're seeing on the ground is a lot of response to that. I would call this like the golden age of land use. Like I have never seen people are civically engaged, they're participating. I know we're gonna hear from folks in Monterey Park. That is astounding, the turnout that was there. And we see that in other parts of the country, like towns that have like 8,000 people, 4,000 people are at a meeting, and they've never been at a meeting before. And we see a lot of creativity and engagement, like with elected officials. People are voted in, people are voted out based on this issue. They're really getting creative with learning about zoning and moratoriums and ordinances and land use in a way that I've never seen before, and is actually pretty beautiful. It's also pretty bipartisan. I would say across the country, people involved in data center fights, I would say are like 60-40 Republican to not. And similarly with the elected officials, the way they land is, I would say you get a little bit more Republican elected officials who are anti-data center. And that grows and sort of changes. But you have people working together that have never probably interacted before. Memphis, where there's a really big XAI Anthropic project, folks who have been in the civil rights, they're like, we haven't seen anything like this since the civil rights movement. We have impacted Black and brown communities, and then we have rich white people from the suburbs, and they're all here. So that could be a really beautiful thing. In some places, it turns a little bit into a broader renewable energy and battery backlash. So it's something to be really cognizant of, because people now kind of assume all new energy is for a data center, and we don't like a data center. So it's pushing, I think, some like existing battery particular, but other energy and transmission situations. So that's a growing trend. So I think, again, Sarah really touched this really well, but there's a lot of talk about these big capital investments, these big name projects that are coming in, like $20 billion from Amazon, et cetera. Almost every state offers a sales and use tax exemption. So what that means is the servers, the chips and equipments, which are essentially, like I would say $18 billion of that $20 billion, state governments are not getting revenue from. In California, we are the exception to that, which is great. We are, I think, actually the only state right now that probably like fully taxes that at our state level. And so I would say we're probably like, I'm gonna say like the only state that really is generating revenue from tech, AI, and data centers in a meaningful way. So I think that's just a context as we're here. And then there's a lot of legislation that kind of offers state incentives and subsidies. I think so, yeah, as we noted, Virginia lost $1.6 billion last year. I think Texas and Georgia each lost over $2 billion for these incentives. And we're gonna go into this, I'll go into this more detail, but we have these big named investments, and there are like really some communities that really make a lot of money, it's really transformative, and then a lot that don't. And I think a trend that we're seeing, which isn't bad on its nature, is a lot of communities, particularly post-industrial communities, have incentives to locate in certain areas, tax abatements for areas they want to see new jobs and industrial development, and so data centers are going there. And so they're getting these abatements without maybe necessarily giving the jobs that were expected. And then there is a lot of negotiation on the ground around payments in lieu of taxes, tax increment finance districts, other types of subsidies. that are often, it's hard for communities because they're often protected under a non-disclosure agreement behind closed door. So yeah, this is just, I think, again, Sarah really got this, but this is like a really weird form of economic development. There's a lot of construction jobs. In rural communities, that can be a lot of out-of-area workers, so it causes really big housing and infrastructure impacts that they might not be ready for. And a very low number, a relatively low number of permanent and indirect jobs. So it's not sort of fitting maybe what some of our traditional subsidies or legislation that was designed to attract development was created for. And then the final piece, which is I think something we've heard a lot in the news, but just these bill impacts from data centers. So again, PJM, which is those 13 states, their bills could rise 60%. I think they already have in Pennsylvania 10 to 40% increase. 1 in 5 people in Pennsylvania had their utilities shut off last year because they couldn't pay them. And it's the #1 leading cause of children going into the foster care system. So this is really real. Some of this increase in what it can mean for people and families and losing their homes and losing their kids, we're seeing in real time. And the fact that in some ways these are the biggest corporations in the world and it's being pushed on folks who already maybe could barely afford their utilities is a real thing to think about. And then in response, what we have been seeing is new proposals around bring your own power, which is basically we don't want this. And also the existing energy and transmission system was really too slow anyway. So the companies bring your own power. So that could mean a range of things. It could mean committing to a power purchase agreement with a renewable project somewhere. It could mean solar on site. In most of these other states, what it has meant to date is a lot of new gas. And some of it is traditional gas, and some of it is just weird things, like really large diesel generators or airplane engines, very strange things, and just this rush to bring your own power and do it as fast as you can. And this third point is that because, let's say in the PJM district, everyone is paying high energy costs, it kind of does incentivize you as a community to get a data center because at least you're getting something. You're already paying the costs for a data center elsewhere. So shouldn't your community get some of the tax or other revenue? So I think as I talked about this, so there are really transformative economic benefits for some communities, and it is variable all over the place. And I would say that's kind of not the norm. And I think that there's a few reasons for that. One, again, is that this value, the chips, the servers and equipments are not considered fixtures. So they're actually generally not subject to property tax. They're not considered an improvement. So some municipalities have other tax structures in place, like a business personal tax that lets them tax those. The other thing that's, I think, important to think about is that makes this sort of an interesting and new type of industry is like your phone, those chips and servers are often replaced every 3 to 7 years. So that's a new sale that you kind of also, as a government, want to capture. So some, Loudoun County in Virginia has done a really good job of this. They have a receipt tax, it's a BPPT. They capture a huge amount of revenue both at initial and future capital investments. That's not something that most municipalities have the power to do necessarily. A lot of states don't allow for local governments to do that type of tax, or they might have sort of not figured out how to put that structure to place yet. So I would say the other type of municipalities that really generate a lot of revenue are if they are a municipal utility also. So they're kind of getting the energy and transmission costs, and also they can be doing different types of fees for the water and the power. So those are, I would say, the 2 types of governments that make a lot of money. They've figured out a way that's not just the property tax. And again, I think just an issue to also think about is, as mentioned, they go into areas of existing abatements, and often, even within property taxes, are negotiating for quite significant abatements and subsidies, even with this fixture issue. So we're seeing a lot of backlash to this abatement now. I think there's a lot of state legislation that's trying to undo in multiple of states the state exemption, and in some of it, a very few amount have been passing. And then at the local level, I think people are growing concerns against things like payments in lieu of taxes and subsidy agreements, and really like kind of educating themselves against, kind of that to be better informed. But a lot of this is in place. So, there's a lot of development agreements that are already kind of in place for negotiation or subsidy agreements. And then I think just another thing to look at is the opportunity costs. You're kind of putting one use that could be impactful and noisy and has diesel generation in a certain area. What does that mean for other surrounding land uses, and to think about setbacks and things like that? And also the energy use is substantial. So what happens then if a manufacturing facility comes and says, hey, we want to build here, but you already gave your energy to a data center? So my recommendation with the economics is to really kind of try to think as a community a way that you can really tie whatever revenue to the full capital costs and the full investment. So, and then structure it in such a way that you are capturing future reinvestment. If you are a community that does proactively want a data center. So I'm going to go quick. So I worked with a student at Berkeley, and she did a research project where she looked at 300 hyperscale projects. So I think we considered it over 100 megawatts, but today that seems tiny. And she had just different interviews with local economic development and planners at some of these locations, just to kind of see like what was their cost benefit analysis when they entered into these projects, kind of what was their process. And the theory that I wanted her to test was this proportional economic benefits, like, are they getting a fair share? Like, how are they thinking about what a fair share is? Because when I look at this and I see these capital costs and then these small portions going to local governments, it doesn't seem like a fair share. And she, again, this was kind of like their perceptions, but it really varied. So, and I think it really varied based on what folks saw as their negotiating power and what they saw as their other options. So what we call post-industrial facilities, so it could have been a steel mill that was there once, they have some contamination, they haven't really seen interest in a while. They don't go back to the table. They take the first offer that comes their way, and it's usually really low. So they are giving substantially more abatements. They're getting substantially less revenue than wealthier communities, which is, I would say, perpetuating some of these cycles of industrial cycles. Then these small rural communities, in some of them, it is transformative. Like, they haven't had this kind of a property tax revenue creator in a really long time. This can help some folks who want to maybe transition out of agriculture. It helps them diversify their economy. But then when the projects come in, they start to have concerns. Water, what it really means for farmland, and then just kind of, I think, as mentioned, having a lot of new workers in a small community. Some of these communities are like 4,000 people. If you bring in 1,500 workers, that's very hard for one community to handle from infrastructure, housing, community perception. And then I would say like the third they did was like growing suburban. So these areas tended to like their data center the first time and then not want more. And one thing about data centers is they do cluster. So it does, if you have a data center, it is likely you will have more data centers down the road. I don't know how, Southern California, we're very constrained, so it might be a little bit different. But generally, they sort of liked it the first time, and then they were like, how is this going to affect like residential and commercial, other uses we want to have? And then we see like some of these large urban uses, like in Memphis, in areas of the South, where they might be existing environmental justice communities. They might be going into brownfields or areas that were zoned industrial, and then can be perpetuating some of these cycles of air pollution. So I would say like the research that the student did kind of found the negotiation was usually set by the time the company came in. And this kind of gets to like, I think the most important point we want to get across, which is like, it is incredibly important to get your land use in place proactively. So that was the determining factor. Did they have a zoning process in place that allowed them to say no to the process? Was it a conditional or special use, or was it zoned by right in an industrial area? And we see a ton of zoned by right in industrial areas. So if they could say no, they could ask for more. Then this second trend, which is really creepy, which is a growing annexation trend. So often, if one community said, we want a little bit better, they would go maybe annex the land into a competing jurisdiction. And we actually get questions about this a lot, of people saying, they're annexing this land into this government. I haven't heard this in California, thank goodness. And then again, the third piece, which was like certain communities can demand more. So, these tend to go, like Loudoun, Virginia is our big, Silicon Valley, those are big examples. They have a lot of fiber. Again, they cluster, so they do like to go where there's cluster. To date, the basic thing is, can you get energy fast? As if you have that and you have the infrastructure, you have a lot of leverage. And if you don't, they might kind of leave if you're asking for more taxes. So this is I just wanted to give 2 case studies of different economic and social outcomes. So this at Better Data Center project, this was our very first project we worked on, and we continue to work on it. It's a homeowner in Jackson, Mississippi, in a Black middle-class neighborhood. One day walked outside and she saw a little sign that said, "We're building a gas plant 12 feet from your house." She got involved. It turned out it was a 760 megawatt gas plant solely to serve Amazon, an Amazon data center. And then as we dug a little closer, it turned out there had been a state law passed in emergency session the year before that said any power plant to serve a data center over a certain side was completely exempt from any oversight from any law in Mississippi, from the Public Service Commission, and that the public interest of getting a data center online trumped any other public interest in the state, including consumer and price protections. So what that meant is the utility could just charge as much as they want. That was fine, as long as they put the bills written, so as long as your receipts are in on time, you can get cost recovery. And then since then, so basically what this means is the literal poorest people in the country are paying Amazon's bills without any price protections, as well as getting the health impacts of a gas plant being placed near their homes and reduced property tax values. And then since then, I would just say, and this is, the governor of Mississippi is coined this term digital delta. He and the utility, they have positioned Louisiana, Mississippi, and Tennessee as this basically, we're going to attract all the data centers. There are so many new data centers that come up in Mississippi every day, and I think, a lot of it is just from this law. And then, yes, I would say the interesting trend has been that the original data center we were working on in gas plant is Anthropic, after we kind of figured that out after a while. And then there's a really famous data center in Memphis that's XAI, that's also now owned by Anthropic, and they're expanding in Mississippi. So some of your good guys are not the best guys. And then here's a kind of sort of an alternate reality, which is Santa Clara, California. Again, so they went all in on data centers. These are primarily not the big hyperscaler projects we hear about today. They're smaller, they're R&D. They also are Santa Clara happens to be the headquarters for NVIDIA and a lot of these companies anyway. So they're kind of all in on tech. There's Silicon Valley, which is their municipal authority. Really has gone all in on data centers. They're their biggest customer by far. I think I saw a stat that 4% of their energy load or demand will be human in a few years. So it's a reverse community, so it's mostly data centers, tech office space, and people go home someplace else because they don't really live in Santa Clara anymore. And they're making a lot of money. I think it's a third of the revenue, at least, is from this. The municipal utility charges a charge for providing power to the data centers. They get a lot of property taxes, they get sales taxes, they're pretty happy with it. I think then there's large transmission upgrades that they're not paying for. So those costs are socialized on other people in the Bay Area or in PG&E, and they are triggered by data centers. So that's even though it looks like they're sort of paying their costs, they're kind of not. And then I think another thing to think of just from a land use governmental perspective, so this is the Super Bowl, and after the Super Bowl, people left and they had no place to get food or drinks because there's only data center and office space in Santa Clara. So they have to go to Sunnyvale. So they have this stadium, but they're not capturing any other revenue that's human at this point anymore because they've gone all in on one use. And so if this doesn't really pan out, like they don't have a coffee shop or a place that residents would want to live and invest in a home. And there's been a few, I think Phoenix is pretty similar where they've done a lot of their downtown has actually been data center and you're not having diversified economic development. So we used to do community benefits, and so a lot of the questions I get are around community benefit agreements. And there's a lot of talk about these right now and how they could benefit communities and kind of fix this paradigm that we talked about, which is these big economic investments not being shared locally. And so there's a lot of buzz around it. So essentially a CBA is an agreement between a developer and a coalition of community groups, or it could increasingly be a local government, and it's called the same thing, and that's very confusing. But generally what you're saying is there are certain things we want to get out of this project, be it funds or setbacks or a different type of monitoring that we're not getting through the permitting process. Let's do an agreement between us and I will generally give up my right to sue you or support you in exchange for certain other things. And I think we've had a lot of success with these in Southern California with like the Staples Center, certain development in downtown LA, which is kind of like actually where CBAs came from. So it's a local tool. And what we often got out of them were things like local hire or workforce training programs that had broader equity, some affordable housing, things that really said, here's a big new use going in our community, here's some ways to actually make it better for the people who will be impacted. And those people were at the table. And they said, this is actually what we want. We want like a real workforce training program that meets the needs of our community. And we want like strong commitments to, we will actually get jobs from this stadium. And there's some other, kind of best practices around them and how they're kind of work in tandem. But I would say generally they work really well with CEQA. So CEQA looks at certain types of impacts and certain types of mitigation, and this kind of allows a community to do stuff outside of CEQA that meets their needs. But generally you also are at the table because you had a CEQA hook. You were able to challenge and delay the project. So in this world, we're often not seeing an environmental process in most states. So it's kind of hard to get the leverage to be at the table. We don't really have quite the same environmental protections that this could be additive to. And the typical benefits, which really do often are around like kind of like workforce and training, can be less applicable because there's less permanent jobs and they're generally kind of union jobs, but they're out of area. And then we sort of have this other like trend of like pilot and subsidy agreement. So I would say like to date, I haven't seen any really good data center CBAs. Most of what we see at the other end, I'm gonna say is like relative, like extremely small compared to the impact. I think Lancaster, City of Lancaster is like maybe the best one so far, and that's like $40 million, which is like really good for data center world, but not actually in context of that data center, which they're not getting tax revenue on. And then some of the other ones like this project in, I saw one in Mississippi that was a $3 billion Amazon project and a one-time $150,000 scholarship fund. So to date, like I think they could have a lot of value, but I think you also really need to have a very clear, again, monetary threshold that's tied to the value of the capital investment and be using them to complement environmental review process. So like if you weren't able to get strong noise in your local ordinance, you could use this tool to get stronger noise protections or stronger protections against on-site diesel. And we've seen, I guess, this is a really fast-moving space, a lot of CBA backlash now. So a few months ago, everyone was talking about it. Now local communities are saying, like, no, that's just buying us off, and we don't want that type of tool. There is kind of more interest in community benefit ordinances, which apply to any sort of project over a certain size or monetary value. And we have, like, in Richmond, California, I think actually originally in San Jose, we have some really good models of what that looks like. But it's essentially like you will go down, sit at the table with certain, to get certain outcomes. It doesn't require you to support the project or give up your litigation. And it can be it traditionally has been a good way to get, like, local or minority contractors or hires in there. And then I think we see a lot of state and local legislation and ordinances that include CBAs in them. But they are generally tied to some kind of streamlining. So whether that works out at the end, I think, is a question. So here's just some levers that we're seeing, like, across the country to get better outcomes. You see Monterey Park up in there. But yeah, as mentioned, this is just like a really exciting time for land use. So people are being really creative in their zoning ordinances. They're also doing these sort of broader municipal ordinances, like around big water users or restricting non-disclosure agreements overall. Again, a lot of this is happening in these energy and transmission planning processes, so it's really important to engage in all of these processes at the same time, because that's where a lot of things about rates and kind of bill impacts and energy is being worked out. We talked about community agreements. And then again, so I think Sarah touched on this, there's just like a ton of state legislation right now. A little bit of it is passing, but not much. A lot of it, I think, is kind of to build awareness of the issue sometimes and to educate legislators. And also on the other side, there are a lot of AI super PACs right now and tech super PACs. So a lot of the state legislators have had a lot of campaign contributions from these companies. So a trend that we tend to see, particularly in states like Virginia that have had Minnesota had data centers for a long time, they have local elected officials who might take a position against a data center, and then when they get to state office, they change their mind because they're getting a lot of campaign donations. And I think a lot of that is why it's kind of hard to get this stuff passed. Again, here's some best practices that we're seeing. We talked about most of these things, but I think doing studies, really looking at the diesel generator issue in California in particular, making sure we can get some stronger stuff out of the Air Board. Right now it's the Energy Commission. I think at a local level in your ordinance, trying to get in noise, setbacks, and then kind of thinking about decommissioning. Who's going to hold, we don't really know who these owners are. Is it going to be the same owners in a few years? Who's going to hold the liability? These are just some thoughts for California. Again, I don't do a lot of data center work in California, so it's kind of informed by previous work on renewable energy siting. And I worked a lot, as did a lot of other people, on a massive land use plan called the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan in maybe the 2011 or so. That was at one point a private and public land plan. It ended up just being public land, but at the same time, I think about 6 or 7 counties in California were given funding from the California Energy Commission to do renewable energy general plan updates. And that was a full process. There was feedback, input, and I think in that process really worked a lot of tensions out over where development should go or should not go in their communities. And I would recommend that counties be thinking of this again. I think that type of thoughtful long-term planning with full public engagement will ultimately get better outcomes for everyone down the road. So yeah, that's landscape scale planning. I also think there's a lot of communities, I don't know here, that would want a data center with certain conditions. So who are those? Working with them, working amongst counties and communities in an area, really restricting non-disclosure agreements, and looking at water conservation. So that's it.